Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
SoundCartel.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. Righto, so how many more interest rate rises will there be? And when will it all end? Can anything be done about inflation? And do we need better direction from the Reserve Bank? These are the big questions facing Australia's economy as we enter 2023, according to our regular economics commentator and Melbourne Uni professor, Neville Norman. Professor Norman says that Australia will avoid a recession, growth will be slow, and there'll be 2 small interest rate rises in coming months. He's discussing the big questions with Jeff Waters.
Yes, Jeff, I've got 4 of them. 1, how many more rate rises? And of course, many people put an adjective before rate rises like damned, or some would say not well rationalised this year. And when will this end? Number 2, what effects of all of that on our lives and businesses? And number 3, what can be done by governments and by ourselves to ease the cost of living and business cost pain? And 4, dare I mention it, should, I put this delicately, big structural changes be made in or at the Reserve Bank of Australia?
Well, we'll get on to that later, and it's a fabulous and important question. But let's start with rates. We'll start at the top of the list. Are we up for more rate rises?
I suspect yes, Jeff, however ill-justified some of them might be. But the easy thing is you can forget all the advanced models predicting Reserve Bank interest rate settings that I've ever enunciated. It's thankfully very simple. Since May 2022, the Reserve Bank of Australia responds to inflation rate rises by rather robotic rate rises. That's a lot of R's. Ignoring the research-based dissection of CPI increases, that the CPI has been mainly generated and increased by external, meaning world energy prices and the Ukraine war, and supply side, meaning shortages of materials and labour, that did not arise from too much spending, which the rate rises are designed to temper. Forget my analysis and my critique. The Reserve is on a mission, and predicting it requires not much more than predicting inflation itself.
Wow, what an assessment. So then where is inflation going?
OK, well, that's important. Remembering that inflation means percentage changes in price levels and not the levels themselves. Remembering that recent housing price falls do not bring inflation CPI down because house prices are not in the CPI directly. We really need to look at global energy prices, supply shortages, and any minor and delayed effects the small rate rises by the RBA have had on measured consumer price indices to which the bank robotically responds. I think it's best to give you assumptions, scenarios and probabilities. Scenario 1, the most likely, without prices necessarily falling, and in many cases still rising, the rate of increases of many prices that you're going to see this year and which surged in 2022 will abate. That's the rate of increase. So CPI growth in calendar 2022 that we saw will fall in the rest of 2023, taking the rate rise pressure off, if you believe the robot. But don't be surprised if the bank swings a trick and changes to another robot programmed to keep rates where they are because the level of prices remains high. I give all that an 80% chance. Now, there could be some nasty unknowns, which the bank never allowed for in its future looks, made scores of times between late 2020 and early 2022. If wars and supply crises erupt again, I say, well, this is much less likely, then back we go. But most likely, to answer the question directly, 2 more small rate rises this year, and that's probably it.
Okay, so what are the economic and business effects of the rate rises we've already seen so far?
Well, we've got detailed research on that, Jeff. There's delayed and slender cuts into economic activity to jobs and share prices. There's a fuller impact, as we've already seen, on house prices, but little downward impact on inflation from the rate cuts themselves. I say that will come from other factors, because the type of inflation we've had is not the old-fashioned excess demand of basic textbooks to which I think the bank and its advisors are beholden.
What can be done about the cost of living pressures that are making headlines everywhere?
Well, this is the third big question that I'm hearing, and it's a good one. There's action by the governments. There's short-term action, which is basically to cushion the blow by subsidies and handouts, and I think that will happen. And the good news is there's enough room in the budget because of the very energy price increases that caused so many of these problems in Australia to give some handouts. Long-term, the answer from all economists has got to be productivity growth, which has been so disappointing, to try and enable wage increases to get back ahead of prices without there being a price further surge. Also, we've got to look at what can be done by us ourselves at home and in business, and it's basically economise. It sounds very old-fashioned, but you've not just heard it from me.
Should there be some sort of fallout for the RBA board for what has happened in recent times?
I hear this all the time, and even more pointedly. I'm afraid I can't answer should questions like that because it becomes advocacy, but I'll give you some economic analysis for those who are making representations about that and who want to form their own answer. Number one, the scores of prognoses the bank and its leaders made between November 2020 and early 2022 that interest rates would not, bluntly, rise before 2024 at the earliest, contradicts every bit of thousands of lectures and economic advice to business that I've ever given, and governments, of not ruling out future prospects that might make for alternatives. And form your own view on that. That's not for me to say. Also, the economic analysis of people relying on that from the very authority that makes the levels of interest rates in Australia was to make borrowing look easier and cheaper for a long time ahead, which of course it hasn't been now, and to encourage the housing boom. And thirdly, the economic analysis of the authority saying that, apologising and say, we're sorry if you took any notice of it, throws to the wolves any respect that anyone might have for statements from that body in its current form. And that's where I stop. But there are a couple of questions that are not being asked, and that is, do the interest rate increases really quell inflation? Does lower unemployment really mean a boom, or higher unemployment mean a slump? And the answer to all of those is the one thing. Normally the answers would be yes, but with supply difficulties it means the reverse. And I think we're going to see rising unemployment rates because of the good thing that supply is coming back. Just ignore it. It doesn't mean that the economy is going into slump. And again, another question being asked, will there be a recession this year? Very unlikely, because we're still fairly strong. Will there be a growth slowdown? Almost certainly.
Professor Norman, you've given us a very detailed assessment of where you see the economy going from here. But as a small business owner, as a retail or tourism or any one of the many small businesses that help support this country, what should I be doing? What should I do at this moment to weather those winds?
Jeff, good question. I rack my brains over that. And when I look at individual businesses, the answers vary according to where you are, the size of business, the type of market you're in, and so on. But three things that I think everyone needs to do. First of all, you should always keep reserves, cash and other reserves, and many of you will be spending them, and those who didn't will be ruining it. Number two, economise on this and get whatever productivity gains you can at the individual level. But of course, that's not what I meant by the national thing. That comes from overall technology. And the third thing, again, is look for different futures, allow for the most likely, as I've done consistently in broadcasts for decades in this series, and look for the worse and the providentially better scenarios, and hope that the good ones come, but be prepared for the bad ones. It's an old-fashioned word for that. It's called insurance. That's why insurance, despite the cost, the certain loss called the premium, makes sense.
That was Melbourne University economics professor Neville Norman. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.